Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, December 8th, where now that I'm feeling a little bit better, I wanted to be able to talk with you about poetry. And as you know, last class there was an overview of what poetry is. There's no clear definition for what poetry is, but you can expect it to be challenging. You can expect it to be dense and compact. It oftentimes has rhyme or meter or alliteration. In other words, there are usually musical qualities, oral qualities associated with poetry. So I always suggest that you read poetry out loud so that you can hear the poetry. You have some probably experiences with poetry if you've read carefully some musical lyrics, and some are better than others, just like with poems. Some musical lyrics do serve as kinds of poems in and of themselves. I always reference the song The Sounds of Silence as a wonderful example of that. And then there are other songs or song lyrics that are made purely to entertain or generate profit. There's nothing wrong with that. And certainly you'll see the same with poems. Some poems are written purely to generate profit or perhaps to entertain. I think what you might find on a greeting card is a good example. But that said, you don't necessarily have to dismiss something because it entertains or it generates profit. But as we've been talking about all semester long in terms of canon, those works considered by scholars and critics to be worth literary study, that these texts are doing more than just trying to entertain or generate profit. They usually have some sort of a social statement. They usually stand the test of time. They usually make some sort of social commentary. And they usually require a good amount of effort from the reader because of the depth and complexity that they have. So we were talking a little bit about formulaic writing when we were talking about the wonderful magic of love as an example of a greeting card poem and how different that could be from something like love poem, both dealing with the same topics, love, but one has a level of depth and complexity. Love poem, where we have a poem that actually talks about the flaws of the subject of the poem, that this person is quite clumsy, at least physically, but quite graceful when it comes to relationships. So all of that was introductory background information to try to prepare us for poetry. And that, yes, you can scan a poem. In other words, you can evaluate poetry in terms of its construction so that you can determine if the poem has patterns in terms of rhyme. And the way we determine rhyme is by looking at the last word of each line of the poem. And that said, you can also look at a poem for its meter or its beat or its rhythm, much like you can look at a sentence and determine its grammatical construction, how many nouns and verbs it's got. But again, that isn't going to get us very far unless we can talk about how and why those elements are important. So in terms of scanning a poem, certainly you're encouraged to do so, to look to see if there are patterns with rhyme or meter, but you need to go beyond just being able to identify a pattern. You need to be able to talk about how and why it's important to the poem itself. So the two examples that the text illustrated, the first in terms of meter, which was waiting for the storm, it has a beat to it. And that beat mimics the sound of raindrops because the subject of the poem is actually waiting for a storm. So that seems to make a certain level of sense. The other poem, Upon Julia's Clothes, it has two stanzas. A stanza is much like a paragraph. It basically is a sectioned off area that talks about one topic. And in that particular poem, the first stanza talks about the silk clothing that Julia is wearing. And then the second stanza talks about the silk clothing that Julia is no longer wearing. She's become disrobed at that point. So it makes sense that we've got a rhyme pattern of AAA, I would argue, in that the first three rhymes that rhyme together are the first stanza, and that is the state of Julia being clothed. And then the second rhyme, the BBB, is the second stanza, which is the state of Julia being unclothed. So this would be another example of how we could talk about the construction of a poem and then relate it to the topic of the poem itself. In other words, we can scan the poem and talk about how the elements of that poem reinforce some of the themes of the poem itself. And I can't say that the answers that I've provided are the only answers, but they are certainly possible answers to talk about the importance of rhyme and meter in those two particular poems, which is all you really have to do. You don't have to come up with a definitive answer. You just have to come up with a possible interpretation. It doesn't even need to be probable. It just needs to be possible by using evidence from the text in order to support that. So our text gives us some suggestions about writing about poetry. If you're using the edition that I had ordered, this is on page 627. Good news. Many of these suggestions are very similar to the suggestions we had about writing about drama and writing about short story, since we've been basically practicing these skills all semester long. Who is speaking? And sometimes it's clear that there's a speaker in the poem. Sometimes it's not. Is the speaker addressing anybody in particular? How did you respond to the speaker? This question has no right or wrong answer. Did you like the speaker, dislike the speaker? What's more important, of course, is why you had those feelings. Is there a specific setting of time and place in the poem? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Does reading the poem out loud help you understand it? And I would suggest, oh yes, that you do want to hear these poems out loud. Does a paraphrase reveal the basic purpose of the poem? In other words, putting it in your own words. What does the title emphasize? So we've talked about all semester long how important titles are. Is the theme directly presented? Probably not. It'll probably be suggested indirectly, and we need to interpret. Does the diction, the use of language, help to reveal meaning? Are figures of speech used? Are there any elements that are being used symbolically, representationally? Is irony used? The unexpected twist? Is the tone of the poem consistent? Are there sounds or words that are repeated? If so, they're probably important. How does the poem's form, its structure, follow or not follow an established pattern? Is the language of the poem intense and concentrated? And I would argue, yep, that's pretty much what poetry is. Did you enjoy the poem? Why or why not is the more important answer or to the question. Is there a particular way to interpret this poem, a particular critical approach? For instance, knowing about the author's biography, does that help you understand the poem? Or knowing about the history of the time period, does that help you understand the poem? How do your own experiences, values, and beliefs inform your interpretation? And understand that there are multiple ways to interpret. One is not necessarily the definitive. So based on that, which one are you going to be choosing? So as we're beginning to talk about poetry, specifically today, I wanted to start with Shakespeare. Not that there wasn't poetry written before Shakespeare, there certainly was, but it seemed like a good place to begin. And one of his most famous poems, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is also one of his most misunderstood poems. So I wanted to talk about that. And also another poem that was written in approximately the same time period, To His Coy Mistress, by another author, Andrew Marvell, writing in a very different style from Shakespeare. So we get to see a little bit of the styles of the 1600s. I try to put the poetry, even though we aren't reading much, we're reading a handful or so. I try to put the poetry in chronological order so that you could see some progression. And while all of this is happening, I'm hopeful that you are working on your second paper, which is on drama. And it's very similar to what you did with the first paper. The difference being, of course, you're writing about drama rather than short story. And I'm providing you with the topics of either talking about canon, those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study, or contemporary relevance, and talking about how one of the plays either does or does not meet the criteria for canon or contemporary relevance. Or you can create your own topic. You just want to run that topic by me. That'll be today's attendance question, by the way. I'm still catching up on the attendance questions. I plan to do that this weekend. But basically, today's attendance question is, what do you think you will be writing paper number 2 about and why? And of course, you aren't necessarily committed to following that. I'm just trying to get a sense of what your thought process is at this point and to encourage you to begin now if you haven't already done so. Paper number 2 is going to be due on December 14th, and that's a Thursday. So we don't have a whole lot of time. Our final exam is December 18th, and that is a Tuesday. And the final exam will be devoted mostly to poetry, 80 points, where I will select some of the poems we've talked about in class and ask you to write some brief essays based on the ones that you select from the selection that I've selected. And it's open book, open notes. And that would be 80 points. What's left is 10 points for short story, 10 points for drama, where again, I'll just select some elements of things that we've talked about over the course of the semester and ask you to write yet even shorter essays in response to that. If we were taking this class in a face-to-face format, you would have 2 hours to take that exam, which is about how much time I anticipate you should take for the exam. I will give you 24 hours in order to complete that exam, but I don't expect you to spend 24 hours completing the exam. But what I will do is that I will post on the 18th and it will be due on the 19th. But we'll talk a little bit more about the final as we get a bit closer to the final. I wanted to talk about, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This is on page 780 of your textbook. And the good news is that now that we've gotten to the actual poetry, I've been able to find links online for these poems. As you know, some of the textbook material I was not able to find links for because it's copyrighted. But luckily, I have been able to find Shakespeare's, or not just Shakespeare's, all at this point of the poetry that we will be doing. You might notice on the course syllabus that sometimes instead of a page number, it indicates handout. That means that poem had been included in a previous edition of your text. No longer is included, at least in the edition you're using, but I am going to be providing that link to you, so if we were in person, you would be getting a handout for that. You can see that in today's notes below. I've got the links for all of the poetry that we'll be doing next class, the ones that are included in the textbook as well as the ones that aren't. But going back to Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, this is an example of a Shakespearean sonnet. And this gets us back all the way to the beginning of the semester when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman and that short story when she was contemplating writing a sonnet and then makes the decision, she has an epiphany that she doesn't have to write a sonnet. And sonnets have very strict stylized structure rules. So it was important that she was thinking about writing a sonnet because her life had been one that was very strict and had very clear and distinctive rules. And the fact that she's thinking about breaking away from that is suggestive how she's thinking about breaking away from that in her personal life as well, as wife and mother. But of course, we know that at the ending of the story, she goes back to writing a sonnet. So what is the strict structure of a sonnet? And there are many different kinds of sonnets, but usually when we talk about sonnets, we mean a Shakespearean sonnet. And those are 14 lines long, not longer, not shorter, 14 lines. They have a particular rhyme scheme or pattern that goes A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. They basically are 10-syllable lines. This is known as iambic pentameter. And they talk about important themes. You just wouldn't talk about common or ordinary things. Shakespeare wrote over 100 of these, no easy trick to do. And we think, or at least scholars think, that Shakespeare wrote most of his sonnets during times of plague, because that would be the time that the theater houses would be shut down. And scholars have tried to put the sonnets in some kind of an order. None of the sonnets were titled, so they are referred to by their number or by their first line. And according to scholars, what they've determined is that there are two main sets of sonnets, what they call the early set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. The early set of sonnets are thought to have been written to one person, generally speaking, and the latter sonnets are thought to have been written to another person. The later sonnets in Shakespeare's career are thought to have been written to someone known as the Dark Lady, which meant a woman with dark features, dark hair and eyes, not necessarily skin. Think Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream, if you'd like. The early set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a young man. perhaps the Earl of Southampton, someone who was Shakespeare's patron, somebody who Shakespeare wanted to flatter. So, if the scholars are correct, and there isn't any reason to assume that they're not. Of course, there are many questions about Shakespeare, as we already established. But at this point, we just have to rely on the scholarship that's been unearthed thus far. So assuming that's correct, the poem Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day falls into the early set of sonnets thought to have been written to a young man, probably the Earl of Southampton, again Shakespeare's patron, which raises a lot of eyebrows because the sonnet sounds like a love sonnet. And might I suggest that it's less about romantic love and it's more about a sonnet of flattery. I wanted to read that sonnet to you just so that you could hear it. You'll notice that many of the links that I'm providing are from the Poetry Foundation. It's a wonderful website for poetry. Not that there aren't other websites as well. And that said, some of the links will have audio attached to it so that you can hear a professional reader read the poem. Or even better yet, for the more contemporary poems, the author themselves. And the author may or may not give a good reading. It's almost like the author of a song may or may not be able to sing their song well. It just depends. But Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, as we reference it, because it was not titled, so we reference it by the first line. Written, we believe, in 1609, but again, we're not certain of anything when it comes to Shakespeare, so this is an approximation of dates. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and oft is his gold complexion dim, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. If you count, you'll see we have 14 lines. And you'll see that it has the rhyme scheme that I had suggested. That day rhymes with May. Temperate rhymes with date. Shines rhymes with declines. Dimmed rhymes with untrimmed. Fade rhymes with shade. Owest rhymes with growest. And the last two lines are a couplet. That means they rhyme together. See rhymes with thee. Those last two lines are indented inwards a little bit. They almost serve as a concluding paragraph. And note that in the sonnet, it begins with a question. Shall I compare thee, thee means you, to summer's day? Note that a gender is never specified in this poem. People just assume it's written to a woman, but nowhere is there any indication that it's written to a woman. So shall I compare thee, should I compare you to a summer's day? And if we think about all of the associations that oftentimes go with seasons, there are many positive associations with the summer. The height of life, beautiful weather, so forth and so on. But the poem goes on and says that thou or you are more lovely and more temperate. You're more beautiful than a summer's day. You're lovelier than a summer's day. You're more predictable and temperate than a summer's day. Because rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. The darling buds of May being the early blooming flowers. Summer's lease hath all too short a date. I love the term lease because lease implies that something is not owned. It's merely borrowed for a while. Which is what we could say a season is. It's not something that we own. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. The eye of heaven being the sun. And of course, you might wonder why didn't the poet just say the sun? It would be easier to understand. Certainly not as poetic, but it also wouldn't keep to the criteria of the rhyme or the meter. Remember the 10-syllable line? For instance, the first line, shall I compare thee to a summer's day. 10 syllables. You'll see this throughout. So it's not an easy thing to do. And often is his gold complexion dim. Often is the sun basically hidden behind clouds. Long literary tradition of talking about the sun as a he. And every fair from fair sometime declines. And in this usage of the word fair, we're not talking about justice. We're talking about beauty. So if you're familiar with the fairy tale, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, who's the fairest one of all, who's the most beautiful. In other words, all things of beauty declines, either by chance, either through a horrible accident, or nature's changing course untrimmed. Nature's changing course means aging, that eventually all beautiful things age and eventually lose their beauty. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. So the poet is saying that the subject of this poem has an eternal summer, that this person will forever be perfection and beautiful. But can that be? That's not true. And the poet continues on by saying, not only that, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. We're given a definition in the textbook. Owest means to possess at this point. Nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade. And notice how death is personified here. Long literary tradition of talking about death as a he. Think about the Grim Reaper. So death will never brag that it will take you. You're never going to lose your beauty. When eternal lines to time thou growest, thou will live on throughout eternity. So how is this possible? Because this hyperbole, this extreme exaggeration, it seems like it's something that could never be achieved unless we read the last two sentences. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now, these lines might be a little bit unclear because of the pronoun this. Now, a pronoun takes the place of a noun. So this is taking the place of a noun, a person, place, thing, or idea. Now, you might have gotten back some papers from me where I might have circled one of your pronouns and indicated something like unclear pronoun reference. And I might have said something like, this what? Be concrete. In other words, it was not clear in the sentence you constructed what noun you were replacing with the pronoun. That said, it was probably clear in the previous sentence, but we can't rely on previous sentences or following sentences when we're looking at grammar. We can only look at the sentence itself. And when we look at that sentence, you used a pronoun, but there was no noun indicated in the sentence that the pronoun was replacing. Of course, Shakespeare and poets don't have to follow grammatical rules. So we don't need to have the noun for this, but we need to be able to figure out what the noun should be. So let me supply you the noun. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. So long lives this poem, and this poem gives life to thee. So basically, as long as the poem exists, and as long as there's somebody to read it, in other words, eyes can see, and men can breathe. And as arrogant as it sounds, it's also true, because here we are in 2023 talking about the subject of this poem. So in this way, the poem has immortalized this person. And think about what a extreme statement that is. Shakespeare is at this point likening himself to a god, because only God can offer immortality. Oh, and Shakespeare. Or artists, good artists. Not surprising when we think about A Midsummer Night's Dream and the way that Shakespeare paired his writing with really poor writing and acting in Pyramus and Thisbe to make basically the same kind of point. So you could see how subversive it was in some ways, and arrogant, but also truthful, where Shakespeare was saying that poetry can immortalize. Because literally, someone can't live through eternity, but the language can if there's someone to read it. So that's an example of a sonnet for you, and if nothing else, the way that this sonnet is misinterpreted is that it's often thought to be a love poem to a woman. Nowhere is there any statement about the gender of the person that this poem is written to. If you're a conspiracy theorist, and of course they are out there, they like to suggest that this is a love poem, and if it was written to a man, there are homoerotic elements associated with it. I think that's less accurate than just saying this is a poetry that attempts to flatter an individual, and if indeed it is written to Shakespeare's patron, someone who would be supporting Shakespeare politically and also supporting Shakespeare financially, it makes a lot of sense to talk about this person's immortal beauty. So that said, we move on to the next poem, which was also written in the 1600s, a very different kind of writing. So Shakespeare is known for his sonnets, but there was another kind of writing called metaphysical writing. And this kind of writing was known for using extreme images, outlandish subjects. It was trying to shock. It was trying to outwit. I call it poetry of the weird sometimes. And this poem, written by Andrew Marvell in 1681, entitled To His Coy Mistress, which is on page 647, is a wonderful example of this. And what you might notice in this poem is that it's not divided into stanzas, which are separate sections of a poem, but there is small indentation that occurs around line 21 or so. In other words, that indicates a shift in subject. And that occurs again, line 33 or so, again to indicate a shift in subject. This poem almost reads like an academic essay with an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. And you should know that at the time, mistress just meant a woman. It didn't necessarily mean anything illicit. It didn't have any negative connotations. And if you know the word coy, which means shy, so this is written to a shy woman, to his coy mistress. And the poem reads, had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires, and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor into dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fond and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in a slow chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Of course, if this is the first time you're reading this poem, or even the second or the third, your first response might be, huh? So going through the poem and trying to paraphrase it, trying to put it in your own language, word for word, can be very useful, especially because this is an example of an older piece of poetry where the language might seem to be a little bit archaic. So what this person is saying here in the first line, had we but world enough in time, if we had time, this shyness lady, this coyness, it would be no crime. So the first part of the poem talks about what they would do if time was endless, eternal. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Imagine just spending the entire day trying to figure out where to go walking. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find, that being a river in India. So you could go to India and look for rubies in the river. I by the tide of Humber would complain, and Humber is a river that flows through England. I would love you 10 years before the flood. Flood is capitalized. That's in reference to the biblical flood, Noah's Ark. So we could go all the way back to the past. And if you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. The idea is that the Jews will never convert, so that ultimately we have eternity that you could refuse me for. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires. And think about some of the imagery that could be associated with vegetables, and some of them look quite phallic, so that this could be perhaps a suggestion of erection. Vaster than empires. It's pretty arrogant. And more slow. And 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. Spend 100 years praising your eyes. 200 to adore each breast. So if 200 years are spent for each breast, that's 400 total. And 30,000 to the rest. Spend 30,000 to the rest of your body parts and praising them. And the last age should show your heart. I'd end with your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. This is what you do deserve, but, and there always is the but, time is not basically limitless. It's limited. This is a Carpe Diem poem, the idea of seize the day, live now. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. In fact, the poem itself even speeds up to illustrate the idea that time is limited. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. You can read eternity, but if you read eternity, then that gives you the rhyme. That eternity is basically in death. Thy beauty shall no more be found. You're going to lose your beauty. Nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Not only will you lose your beauty in death, but basically you will spend your time in an echoing vault, a crypt, in effect, a marble one. And then worms shall try that long preserved virginity or virginity. So this is a poem where the writer of the poem is trying to convince a female, a coy mistress, to give up her virginity. And he says that if she does die with her virginity, it'll ultimately be taken by the worms. Think about the worms as a phallic symbol burrowing themselves into her. And of course, this is outlandish. And we're not supposed to take this seriously. This is absurd. And it's an element that oftentimes is associated with the metaphysicals. I know some people love the metaphysicals because they really are trying to push boundaries. Other people hate the metaphysicals because they think they go too far. But I wanted to give you an example. It certainly is different than a sonnet like Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. It says that your quaint honor would be turned to dust and into ashes all my lust if she doesn't give up her virginity. The grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do there embrace. So if you want to go to the grave this way, you're going to die alone. Now, and notice there's a brief indentation here for the last part of the poem. This is almost the third part of the third part argument. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, while you're young and beautiful, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires. In other words, while you have energy and desire and lust. Now let us sport us while we may. And sport is basically playing. And I would argue that metaphysical poetry is also a kind of playing. You're not supposed to take it too seriously. Now let us sport us while we may. And now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in its slow chapped power. Taking control of time rather than letting time take control of you. That you are going to consume time rather than letting time consume you. Now let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. Let's become one. In other words, let's consummate this relationship. And tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. And that we usually talk about the golden gates of heaven, but there are also iron gates of life, and that we should enjoy this world as much as waiting for the next. Thus, we cannot make our sun stand still. In other words, we can't stop time. Yet we will make him run. This idea, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, giving somebody a run for their money, so to speak. A reader reading this poem would have also realized the illusion that there was another metaphysical poet at the time who was even more famous. His name was John Donne. And he wrote a poem called The Sun Also Rising. And it basically is about two lovers in bed who are lamenting the fact that the night is coming to an end and that the sun is rising. And that means that the day is going to have to begin and they're going to have to end their lovemaking. So anybody reading this poem and would have heard the reference, though we cannot make our sun stand still, would realize, this is a kind of wink and a nod to the sun also rise, or to the sun rising of John Donne's poem. And while certainly you can enjoy all of these poems as independent units, knowing how they were influenced by other poems, either from the same time period or previously, obviously they couldn't be influenced by poems from the future because the future hadn't happened yet, can help you have a better understanding of the poem. I liken it again to music. You can understand a song as an individual unit, but understanding how that songwriter and how that singer was influenced by musicians from the past and also musicians from their time period just gives an added richness and depth and understanding. So the more poetry you read, then the more likely it is you'll be able to see how previous poets influence future poets. But that's also true with short story and drama, but perhaps especially with poetry. Because I think you'll see with poetry that, and I had asked you to define what poetry is in a discussion forum question, and it's not an easy thing to define. Nevertheless, it did have structure and rules associated with it, as we saw with something like a sonnet. And different poems oftentimes had different structures or rules associated with them, and they still do sometimes. But I think you'll see as we get to more contemporary poetry, there was this need to break those rules. Again, I think about music, where oftentimes there were specific structures and expectations with music. And again, those have been shattered as time has gone on when you've got new artists who are basically trying to have a unique voice and a unique way to interact with their audience and to express themselves through their art. So you can see in the notes below that I've talked a little bit about the Shakespearean sonnet as well as To His Coy Mistress. Many of these poems have questions at the ending of the poems that can help direct your response. So we're told at the ending of To His Coy Mistress, or asked, I should say, do you think this Carpe Diem poem, which means seize the day, is hopelessly dated, or does it speak to contemporary concerns? And that the poem is divided into a three-part argument, which I had suggested earlier. And what is the tone in the first part? How does that differ from the other parts? And then it makes reference to some other poetry that I didn't assign. That's not to say that you may not have experience with that, but that would be outside of the context of this particular class. So I like the 1600s. It's the area that I specialized in college, which is why we're going to have one more poem from the 1600s. This is the author to her book. This will be next class by Anne Bradstreet. One of the reasons why I like this poem so much is because it's written by a woman, and this was a very male-centric time in terms of writing poetry. So we'll talk about that. Because I've devoted so much time, or will be devoting so much time, to the 1600s, the 1700s is getting short shrift, I suppose. Just one poem from the 1700s by William Blake, The Sick Rose, an example of romantic poetry, which is less about a romance between two people and more about the celebration of nature in the natural world, as we'll talk about. A poem from the 1800s, and considering the locale that we are in, talking about Emily Dickinson makes perfect sense, and we'll talk about her poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Of course, Emily Dickinson being local from Amherst. And then we're going to see a shift. Got a poem called American Poetry that goes outside of the chronology, that talks about some of the ways that perhaps American poetry is different from British poetry. But I would say that it also is indicative of some of the ways that poetry of the 1900s is different, and the 2020s is different from the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1600s. And then what we will be doing is reading some more contemporary poetry from the 1900s and the 2000s, so that we can get a sense of some of the similarities and also some of the differences. So again, that leaves us with the discussion forum question, where I would like you to consider what you might be writing paper number 2 about, which is about drama. Repeat of what you did with paper 1, approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or short as it needs to be. And I can take that paper up until the final exam, but do note that it is over on the day of the final examination. So all revisions, everything else has to be in by that date. I will not be accepting things after the final exam. It has ended. But ideally, you would have paper number 2 done before the final. You would have that submitted in on the 14th so that you could devote yourself completely to the final exam on the 18th, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But again, I'd like to know what you're thinking about writing about for paper number 2 and why. I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing better, I'm glad to say. And we will continue on next class with, of course, poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.